Hello and welcome everybody to episode 8 of The Faithful and the Questioner. My name is Max. I am joined again by my sister Sammy. Sam, how you doing? First of all, congrats on the wedding last month. That was a lot of fun.
That was a lot of fun.
Yes, it was. Well,
I'd show off my ring, but I keep forgetting to put it on. Oops.
Well, it was a good time for everybody.
Off to a good start.
Congrats there. I feel like we at least got to point that out. Good choice of companion. He's a good guy.
He's a good guy. He'll be on for a future episode.
Yes, I'm looking forward to that. I want to talk science. I meant to ask you beforehand, but he needs to teach me how to do differential equations.
I can do differential equations.
Yeah.
I'm an engineer.
Well,
or I used to be able to. I don't know.
Well, I'm in finance, so our math doesn't go far beyond like addition and subtraction. I might need some help after that, but might be a bit of a jump. Anyway, the topic today is going to be the book of Genesis. So, Sam, I'm glad we can finally touch on this for a lot of reasons. I kind of gave you a heads up ahead of time, but I'm probably going to be hammering a lot about Noah's Ark and Abraham sacrificing his son. Although, to be fair, I did talk about C.S. Lewis's explanation of that, which I will go into, and I think he did have a good explanation. So, why don't I let you take the lead here? How do you want to do this? Just want to...
Well, I kind of want to... You mentioned it, but you said that you haven't gone through and read the book of Genesis, which there's a lot, like a 50 chapters. But I'm not trying to criticize you. I'm just curious what stories you're familiar with.
Okay, yeah, sure.
There's probably a lot of stories that you aren't, but I'm curious to hear about sort of what the common perception is of the stories in Genesis.
Yeah, so first of all, let me point that out. Thank you for reminding me. Sam was kind enough to send me 2 YouTube video synopses of the book of Genesis. Kind of part 1 was talking about the creation, and then part 2 was all about Abraham and his family. So we'll be referencing those a lot. I will put links in the show notes as well if people want to go and look at those.
Shout out Bible Project.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, we will tag them, make sure they get credit on this. We may or may not show a couple of clips from there, but we'll make sure we link to the videos we're talking about. But yes, Sam, to that point, so the creation of God, God's creating the universe and humans, Garden of Eden, the snake who's a little bitch, and I forgot what came directly after that, but Cain and Abel, Noah's Ark, Babylon, and then Abraham, which we talked about this beforehand again, but it's funny. Those videos didn't actually reference Abraham's sacrificing his son, which I thought was a little funny.
Yeah, they skipped that. It's kind of important.
Yeah. So I want to touch on that. We'll definitely get into that here. But what you sent me, I think, I watched them again today, as I mentioned. So I think those are the limit of my knowledge on that right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those are the classic. Maybe not some of them, but a lot of those are the good old children's Bible emphases of Genesis. But there's a lot that happens, and they're not just stories that are crazy and fun to read. So something that I like about the Bible Project, even if it does leave out some of those details, like, for example, not going into depth or talking at all about Abraham and Isaac and that sacrifice that God calls him to do, it does do a good job of summarizing the main point of the book of Genesis. And they also, by the way, have videos for every single book of the Bible. So if you're ever curious about a single one, they have a whole episode dedicated to summarizing it. But one thing, I think this is the Bible Project's tagline, is talking about how the Bible is one cohesive story that all points to Jesus. So Genesis, you might think it's like all stories about pre-Jesus, but and it is, but it's also not absent from Jesus. It is telling the story of how he ultimately came into the world through the line of Abraham, which is a huge emphasis in Genesis. So having that in mind, that this isn't just a collection of random crazy stories, it's actually intended to zoom in on human history leading up to what will be the line of Jesus.
And real quick on that note, so the Genesis, because the Bible, you got the Old Testament, the New Testament, and
That's it.
And then the Book of
Well,
Mormon.
there's subcategories, but yes, those are the two big categories.
Okay, so but Genesis is its own book, but it's like the first part of the Old Testament then?
Yeah.
Okay.
First book of the Bible, first book of the Old Testament, first book of the Torah.
Okay. So maybe, I mean, going into this, God creates man in, I mean, the Garden of Eden, right? So how does that work? What's the start there?
Like the creation story, or specifically Adam and Eve?
I mean, both, I suppose. I guess, is it in Genesis? I know they say something along the lines of, I think this is Genesis, but God created the world in like 6 days or something.
Yeah, he created the world in 6 days and then rested on the 7th day, it says.
Okay, so dumb question, but you probably know what I'm going to ask, right?
Is it literal?
Well, kind of, yeah. Like days didn't exist until the earth existed, and then why did God have to rest?
Oh, yeah. 2 separate questions. Good questions. I don't tend to believe that it was literal. Some people do. At the end of the day, I don't really think it matters whether it's literal or not, because God can speed up time and do whatever he wants. But I feel like I'm not exactly sure, but I think the word for day kind of is a similar, it might be the same word. Don't quote me on this, but I think I heard this once, that in the book of Ecclesiastes, it talks about like, oh, there's a season for everything, a time for peace and a time for war, a time to weep and a time to dance and stuff like that. The word for time, I think, is the same word as for day, or like maybe similar root or something. So it is an ambiguous amount of time that it describes. I could be totally wrong on that, but I think I heard that once. So
that would be much nicer for my brain to wrap my head around than to take that literally. So
right. And this is also obviously the person writing this, which the book of Genesis is generally attributed to Moses, who we haven't met yet. He comes in Exodus, but he had this very close relationship with God. God gave him the laws. God talks to him a lot, gives him a lot of information. So this is attributed to Moses, but there's also probably a lot of oral tradition that went into the book of Genesis, these stories being told again and again and again. So the person writing about the creation story, obviously God gave this information, but it was still a human writing it, and they weren't there. So they're probably writing it in a mostly poetic storytelling kind of way and not a scientific account. So if you're trying to read it as a scientific account, you're going to be pretty unsatisfied. And that's not the point. The point is just to say God created the world, and here is a poetic way to describe how that may have gone down. But I don't tend to think that it was meant to be taken literally, because that's probably wasn't the focus of the story.
Okay.
The Bible Project also has a really interesting podcast about cosmology, which is just like the understanding of how the world is and came to be. Like, for example, our cosmology, like we know the world was made up of atoms, which are made up of protons and neutrons and electrons. And we know that matter exists and all that stuff. So that's like our perception, but they didn't know about that back then. So their perception is, oh, the world started in this way. There was the waters and the earth, and those were separated. And it's just kind of like the traditional school of thought about how the world came into existence. And then the Bible is attributing that to God and being more poetic in the way that it describes it than maybe other cultural traditional ways to think about it around that same time.
Okay, so how did Adam and Eve come into existence? And actually, one note that I just thought was kind of interesting is Adam, I guess, means human in Hebrew.
Yeah, they said that in the podcast. Adam means
Adam,
human, sure. Or yeah. So language is fun. It's always fun to figure out what things mean. It's so fun because I think another one of your questions was asking about the renaming. Abram into Abraham, and there are many examples of people getting renamed in the Bible, and the footnotes are always fun because they talk about what people's names mean. So later on, there's the story of Jacob and Esau has like a lot of body hair, and his name just means like hairy. And Jacob's name means the deceiver because he deceives his father into getting his older brother's birthright, other things. So, and then if a woman has a child that she doesn't really like or something, the name of the child is like, you have caused me pain or something like that. So, but just anyway, so it's significant to know what some of these different names mean, which is interesting. And that's probably like the names that we see in the Bible are not necessarily universal across different language translations. So like we read, it just might be like pronounced or a different version or a different interpretation of the actual word to translate it into English. So anywho, it's interesting. But yeah, what do you know about Adam and Eve, how they came to be?
Well, this is one big area of Christianity where I'm like, this is, in my mind, Adam and Eve is like the anti-evolution argument, which I think is ridiculous. So I absolutely believe Jesus existed. I believe Abraham existed. I believe Moses existed. I mean, there's not like a question about that. But Adam and Eve, like that's, I don't think people get zapped to existence on Earth. So how they were part of the original creation, like would the Bible actually, this is probably a really dumb question. Does it say anything like about dinosaurs, or does it imply like humans were the first being on Earth?
Well, it says animals came before Adam and Eve first off. So Adam and Eve definitely weren't the first
credit where credit is due.
And animals can be a very general category, so you never know what all is included in that. There are mentions of these like beasts I think it's in Genesis or in Job, like very early in the Bible, they talk about Leviathan and the other one, Behemoth. Let me see where, I'm going to ask ChatGPT where that is. I think it's in...
Good old ChatGPT.
Good old Chat. It's very handy for this. Oh, it's a sea creature. Leviathan was a sea creature mentioned in Job 41, in the Psalms, serpent-like creature, etc. So that's like a sea monster, which, as you know from like the evolution documentaries we watched as a kid, the sea creatures came first, which is consistent with the Bible.
Right. Okay. Fair enough.
And then I think Behemoth is also mentioned in Job.
I think there was an episode of Supernatural about Leviathans too.
Yeah, so anyway, there's these kind of like, I imagine archaeology, to the extent that we know it today, wasn't as advanced back then, but I'm sure
probably
if dinosaurs existed, which I believe they did, they probably just didn't have quite the language to describe it or the science to put the pieces together in the way that we have today. So I don't think that the creation story, in my opinion, necessarily rules those out. It just isn't explicitly mentioned, which we shouldn't expect it to be because they don't have the scientific language for it.
Okay, that's a very, very fair point, and that does make me feel better, because when I hear most religious people talk about the Garden of Eden, I kind of zone out just because I'm like, often they're the same people who are anti-evolution, which I think is absolutely ridiculous. And there's a scientist, let me make sure I got his name right. Let's see. So to be fair, I haven't read much of this guy. I think I've seen like a few clips of him on Instagram, and I think there was a South Park about him. But the scientist Richard Dawkins, have you heard of him?
Sounds familiar.
We'll have to watch some videos sometime. Again, I don't know much about this guy, but he's a biologist and a zoologist, and I think he's known for being an atheist, largely because he leans on this science so much. But he's like a hardcore believer in evolution, and I think has been insulted by a lot of Christians for that reason.
Mm-hmm.
So throwing that out there, we can look into that later. But a very intelligent guy. Want to dig into that a little deeper.
Mm-hmm. I have a friend. So kind of the inspiration for this episode, just to bring in some context why we want to talk about this. It's the beginning of the year. Happy 2025. And Kenny and I and some friends are trying to read the Bible like all the way through in a year. And so our Bible plan just concluded Genesis. And so we all got together and met up, and we're planning to meet up like once a month or twice a month to talk about where we're at. But we just finished Genesis. One of the people in that group is an evolutionary biologist that Kenny knew as a grad student from CU. So he's also very passionate about biology and creatures and how they came to have the traits that they have. And he studies bugs primarily. But anyway, he's also a super smart science guy that is also a Christian, just like Kenny. So just because one smart scientist is atheist because of his science expertise, another guy is a Christian because of his.
Yeah, I get that. That's totally fair. Is this the pub theology stuff you guys do, or is this something separate?
Something separate, but you met this guy at pub theology.
Okay, yeah. Sam and her now hubby kind of do this pub theology thing every week or two, where you meet up, have dinner, and talk about a topic within the Bible. And last week's topic was gambling, which I just happened to be an expert in. So it was nice to bring something to the table there. I'm glad I could contribute, but that was fun.
You did contribute. You were the highlight of the conversation. Everybody in the group was like, "I've never gambled. Can you teach me how it works?" And
well, it was just fun because it's the same idea as the podcast, where I'm not anti-Christian by any means, but I'm not at the same level as you guys, and I have like a gambling statistics probability background. But my conclusion to that topic was that it's fine as long as you're not like neglecting your family or ruining your life because of it. So
yeah, addiction's bad. Don't be addicted to gambling or anything else.
Yeah.
And be wise with your money. And
yeah,
if you can be wise while gambling and have it in moderation.
Anything in moderation, I think, is pretty fine.
Not Job. Paul says in the New Testament, everything is permissible, but not everything is beneficial. And so that's a good filter to run everything through, is like, is the thing that I'm doing benefiting me or others, or is it harming me or others? And if it's being harmful, then don't do it.
Nah, I like that. That's fair.
Anyway,
we should do an episode on maybe potentially gambling at one point, but I don't want to drift too far here.
We can do a whole episode on like money in general if you want.
Yeah, that could be fun. Talk about Babylon there. That's a good one. But yeah, going back to creation, Garden of Eden, and we kind of established the evolution thing. So to your point, you do believe in evolution and the Garden of Eden, and the way it's described is animals, the generic term, existed before Adam and Eve, which, okay, I like that. That's a much better interpretation, in my opinion. I think that's much more fair than a lot of people display it. I like that. So
Another thing I want to mention that maybe we can talk about more on like a sciencey episode, but there is also stuff happening outside of the Garden of Eden, because in chapter 3, after Adam and Eve eat the fruit, which God said you're not supposed to do, they get cast out of the garden and they're blocked off from the tree of life, which is like at the center of the garden. So there's stuff outside the garden. So this is not like the system that we're looking at in Genesis 1 is not like, once you zoom on Adam and Eve, is not the whole earth. Like there might be other stuff happening. So I don't want to rule out the possibility that other evolutionary things are happening outside of the garden. And then later on, this gets really confusing, and I'm not an expert in this, but part of the way that wickedness enters into the world after Adam and Eve, obviously like Adam and Eve sin, Cain and Abel sin, but there's also this like interbreeding later on. So it's not just like, there's a lot of incest, but it's not just incest. There's also Adam's descendants have sex with this like Nephilim creature, which is like a fallen angel.
Oh, so it's fine. Okay.
So, but it's not fine. These are not good creatures. So anyway, that's part of how like the bloodline gets contaminated by these like non-human fallen angel type creatures that were outside of the garden that begin to interbreed with Adam and Eve's bloodline, which is part of the reason that God floods the earth to kind of like clear out all the wickedness that had entered through that and start afresh with Noah and his family.
Okay, what the hell? Okay, I had no idea about this part. So Adam banged an angel? What? Am I understanding that right? What did you say?
So it's in Genesis 6. Let me read what ChatGPT says. The Nephilim are mysterious beings mentioned in the Bible, specifically Genesis 6, 1-4. It says, Genesis 6:1-4 says, when human beings began to increase in number on the earth and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. Then the Lord said, my spirit will not contend with humans forever, for they are mortal. Their days will be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterwards, when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them. They were the heroes of old, men of renown. So it talks about Nephilim as the sons of God, which is sometimes a word for angels, I think. So,
Okay.
you know how like Satan was a fallen angel?
Yeah, I've heard that, and I kind of wanted to go into that with the snake because it's like a general story.
So this could be a similar thing. Again, I'm not an expert in this, but this is kind of my understanding is like Nephilim are a similar category where they're like fallen angels of some sort. They're also called heroes of old, men of renown. So I guess they had some sort of reputation outside the garden, but they're all men, and they're probably all like big and attractive because they're called like heroes of old, men of renown. So then they have sex with all the women, and then that's how this contaminated bloodline happens.
Okay. Fair enough. We can go into that. I centering on the Garden of Eden though. Can we talk about like them gaining autonomy in the apple, and then the snake, and then the apple? Before we.
What were you referring to? Are you pulling the autonomy thing from the Bible Project video?
That's the word he used. Yeah.
Okay.
He said, "Do you trust God to tell you what right and wrong is, or do you want to eat the apple of life?"
The apple from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and then there's a separate tree that's the tree of life, which they aren't allowed to eat.
Okay, but the snake is the one hanging out in the bad tree and convinces them to
eat the fruit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What's wrong with that?
So your question is like, what does he mean by seize autonomy?
No, I think I get what that means, but what's the issue with eating the apple in the first place?
Because he told them not to.
Yeah, but why?
I mean, that's exactly what the enemy says. He's like, well, that's a stupid reason. Why don't you
it kind of feels like it. Like, what's wrong with gaining more knowledge?
Well, it was like God said, you have access to all of the things in the garden except for this one tree. If you eat from it, you will certainly die. And let me see where he found this. Trying to remember the exact verse. Anyway. Oh, the Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and take care of it. And the Lord God commanded the man, you are free to eat from any tree in the garden, but you must not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, for when you eat from it, you will certainly die. And then basically, I don't necessarily think they knew it was the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, but Satan enticed them and kind of told a bit of a lie that if they ate from the tree, they would be like God.
Okay, and God doesn't like that because he doesn't like people imitating him.
I mean, he likes people imitating him in the way of like his character, like we are as Christians supposed to imitate God in a way, but the desire to be like God is prideful to think that like, oh, this person, this being that created me, now I want to be on the same level as him rather than submit to him. And so that was kind of the temptation that Satan put out there that enticed Adam and Eve to eat the fruit, even though God explicitly said not to. So it was pride, it was disobedience, it was a lot of things. But I understand how it could be tempting because you're like, well, you've given us everything. Why not this other? Why not this last thing? Why can't we have that too?
I'm one of those kind of there's one way to find out kind of guys. So it's like, might as well try it, just see what happens.
Right.
Okay, now you use the word. I think you use the word Satan instead of the snake, but they're kind of interchangeable, right? So the snake, and I think we talked about this in another video, but the snake in the Garden of Eden is Satan, right?
Yeah.
Why? And God created all these animals. Why create snake and even put the temptation out there?
Well, God didn't necessarily create. He didn't create Satan to be evil. He created the angels, and then Satan and I think a third of them fell and decided to rebel against God, because just like humans, they
felt the
had
temptation.
free will and they decided to go against God. And either you have free will and evil exists, or you're just little robots and evil doesn't exist. And God didn't want us to be robots.
Okay, so humans have free will. Angels also have free will, even though we generally think of angels as benevolent creatures. I have seen plenty of portrayals where there are like angels in hell and fallen angels and whatnot. Okay.
And demons, I think, are fallen angels.
I don't think so. At least not in the lore that I know, but maybe in the actual Bible. I'm thinking of.
I don't know. Don't.
I think demons are below like angel power. I think it's like God, archangels, angels. It's like God, Satan, archangels, angels, demons, ghosts. Some I'm kind of bullshitting here a little bit, but it's something like that.
Okay, yeah, I don't know if there's an explicit ranking laid out in the Bible other than like obviously God is the most powerful, but anyway, so yes, so God wasn't like, let me create an enemy for myself. Not that I know of.
To be fair, he wants to keep things interesting.
Could be, but I think at the same time, God knew, okay, if I give mankind free will, they're going to rebel. It wasn't a surprise. And so that is like the whole narrative of scripture is like, God knows the people are going to screw up, and they do. And he has a whole plan that succeeds despite all these people's failures. And the success of his plan is the redemption of all those failures. Like, throughout all the mistakes that humanity makes, Jesus ends up coming into the world, dying for our sins, and he will redeem the world. And so it's like, through all of human sinfulness, God is succeeding in his plan to restore human sinfulness. It's kind of like a circle.
Oops, sorry, I was on mute there. Sorry, I heard a little bit of that. I was looking for a video I wanted to share. Again, always trying to keep things fun here. There was an episode of Family Guy where Peter Griffin was thanking God for a second. He said, why would God create an enemy for himself? I thought this was funny, so let me know if you can see this. Let me make sure you can hear this. But
okay. I want to thank God.
You hear that?
I want to thank the Lord God, because it's not really up to me. It's up to him. And I want to thank the devil too, because that's why God's there. He's minding a fence, making sure that guy never comes back. If it weren't for the devil, God would probably go insane, blow his brains out from boredom, Everybody likes to feel useful. Making the world go round.
Anyway, sorry, I thought it was a little funny. But like, God wouldn't create an enemy for himself. Maybe he wanted to just keep things interesting. Okay, so the angels
tells a good story.
Yeah, the angels, the fallen angels kind of gained consciousness, and they drifted away from God. The devil, Satan, I guess, kind of took the lead, and then he drifted Adam and Eve away into temptation, I guess.
And that's what deep, like you read Screwtape Letters, and
right?
like,
Yeah, that was
on a smaller individual scale, that's still happening constantly. Like that spiritual warfare of demons or the enemy or spiritual forces that are against God, pulling people away from him with the intent of separation from God, evil, all that bad stuff. And you see that all over the world. A lot of awful stuff is happening.
Okay, so I'm just trying to think if there's anything else I want to touch on as far as that goes. So the snake is literally Satan, devil Satan. That's what it's meant to be.
That's how I understand it.
Let me just double check my notes here before we kind of drift into another topic. But that's.
Did you get the hint about Jesus in the story, like through the Bible Project video? In regards to
there was maybe we're talking about the same thing or not, but there's something they said about some being coming to smash and like stomp on the snake.
Mm-hmm.
The snake, and then at the same time, like the snake bites his heel, and the person gets poisoned and dies. But it also said, I think it said that was a woman. So I thought it was supposed to be a metaphor for Jesus, but what am I missing here?
Well, born of a woman. Let me find the exact verse. It's in Genesis 3. Yeah.
Born of a woman. That doesn't.
I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. He will crush your head, and you will strike his heel. So this is talking about the snake. The snake will crush your head, and you will strike his heel. So he's talking about how the offspring of the woman, so like from Eve all the way down to Jesus, it's kind of this face-off that's predicted here between Jesus and the enemy. And they talked about this wounded victor in the video, if you remember that. And
yeah,
so,
well, that's what I was referring to. So the wounded victor is Jesus?
Yeah.
Okay, so that's what I thought, but then I thought the guy said it's a woman who's going to do this, but then you said it's born of a woman.
Well, it says, I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. Offspring is also like seed. So I guess her offspring is Jesus. The devil's seed, I guess, is the continued devil or continued presence of evil or whatever. I'm not quite sure what that means, but yeah, I understand it to be the face-off between Jesus and Satan, and how Jesus is like the character that has to die. It's like Harry Potter. Neither can all the other survives.
Yeah, I've heard some stories with Harry Potter where it's like Harry's an allegory where Harry is Jesus, Dumbledore is God. God sacrifices Harry to beat the devil, which is Voldemort. And like Harry didn't exactly rise from the dead, but he was supposed to die at one point. Anyway, fun stuff.
Yeah.
Well, I guess he did. Spoiler alert. He did kind of die in the Deathly Hallows and then came back. So okay, whatever.
Yeah. Love Harry Potter. Shout out.
Yeah, absolutely. Good series. But that never actually happens. It's the metaphor for the victor crushing Satan, but as we see it today, Satan is still very much around. It's not like Jesus showed up in the Garden of Eden and actually killed the snake. So in the story, Adam and Eve kind of take off and hide from God, and they distance themselves from God. Does anything actually happen to the snake?
I think the snake keeps hanging out. God curses the snake, and he says, "Cursed are you above all livestock and all wild animals. You will crawl on your belly, and you will eat dust all the days of your life." So there's theories that before this, it was more like a lizard. Like the word serpent also describes like amphibians, and then now he slithers instead. I don't know, but I'm pretty sure he's still hanging out. But you're right. That's a good point that like, okay, Jesus came, he died, but there's still all this evil going on. So what gives? And it's like, I forgot what the fancy theological word for it is, but basically the idea of something that has already happened and also is still happening and will ultimately still happen, which is kind of the story of like Jesus had victory when he died for our sins on the cross and was raised from the dead, and everyone that believes in him is forgiven of their sins and will have eternal life in a relationship with God. And that is all done. And yet the redemption of the world has not yet happened. So that's where the second coming of Jesus and the ultimate defeat of sin and death and evil is going to happen. So we've gotten kind of the first fruits of what is yet to come through the life of Jesus that we read about in the New Testament. But that's not the end of the story quite yet.
Okay, and then what happens with Adam and Eve? Do they just breed and then you get this long chain of, ancestors and humanity grows?
Yeah, so that's where the rest of Genesis picks up. So they're cast out of the garden. They start to have, like, Cain and Abel have interpersonal conflict. There's people marrying and having more babies, and then there's the Nephilim coming in and having sex with the women.
Jordan, one of the questions that you get asked a lot, personal view of.
Okay, but then this leads to Noah's Ark, right? So God is a little upset with these guys because they went against what he wanted. And then he wants to kill everybody by flooding the earth, right? So this is Noah's Ark, isn't it?
Right. So
Oh, actually, and I'm sorry, I was just checking the order of the slides, but the Noah's Ark, this is before Cain and Abel, right?
Cain and Abel happened before Noah's Ark.
Okay, sorry. In that case, let's transition to that. So, what's the transition from Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve, to Cain and Abel before we jump into Noah's Ark?
Well, it just said that Adam and Eve had 2 sons named Cain and Abel.
Shit. Okay, I didn't realize they were supposed to be direct descendants of Adam and Eve. Okay.
Yeah, they're like the first. They're the second and third, third and fourth humans, I guess, to exist.
Okay, I did not realize that. I thought they were much further down the line.
Nope, they're directly after. So they definitely take after their parents in disobedience and continuing sinful patterns. But generally, like, Cain is the bad guy and Abel is the better guy. And Abel is said to always give like the best sacrifices and stuff to God, and Cain gets kind of jealous. And let me just read the story. I'll just start from the beginning. Adam made love to his wife Eve, and she became pregnant and gave birth to Cain. She said, "With the help of the Lord, I have brought forth a man." Later, she gave birth to his brother Abel. Now, Abel kept flocks, and Cain worked the soil. In the course of time, Cain brought some of the fruits of the soil as an offering to the Lord, and Abel also brought an offering, fat portions from some of the firstborns of his flock. The Lord looked with favor on Abel and his offering, but on Cain and his offering he did not look with favor. So Cain was very angry, and his face was downcast. Then the Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it." Now Cain said to his brother Abel, "Let's go out to the field." While they were in the field, Cain attacked his brother Abel and killed him. Then the Lord said to Cain, "Where is your brother Abel?" "I don't know," he replied. "Am I my brother's keeper?" The Lord said, "What have you done? Listen, your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. Now you are under a curse and driven from the ground, which opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you work the ground, it will no longer yield its crops for you. You will be a restless wanderer on the earth." Cain said to the Lord, "My punishment is more than I can bear. Today you are driving me from the land, and I will be hidden from your presence. I will be a restless wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me." It goes on. But basically, yeah, Cain kills his brother because he's jealous that God seems to like him better. And then God curses the ground because Cain is he's a farmer, basically. So that's kind of like where we're discussing the difference between like work and toil. Like, God gives Adam work to do before the fall. So work is not necessarily a bad thing, but toil is like work without fruit. And so that is kind of where that laborsome, toilsome work comes into play when God curses the ground because of Cain. So anyway, there's a meme that I put in there that I thought was funny from the PowerPoint, if you just want to show that.
Oh, whoops. Sorry. Got a little ahead here. Is there a...
Go to the bottom, second to last slide.
Yeah, sorry. Give me 1 sec. I can get you pulled up here. Oh, I think, yeah. I assume you're talking about this one, right?
Yeah, I'm talking about this one. For those of you just listening, it's a meme where God says, "Hey, where's Abel?" And Cain says, "Wouldn't you like to know, weather boy?" All
right.
With the classic.
That's one of my favorite videos.
It's a good one.
Funny.
Okay,
so...
Anyway, that's basically what he says. He says, "I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper?"
So Cain's kind of a dick. I mean, it's a sibling.
We all are,
right?
know,
like, how often do you think about killing me? Probably hourly, right? It's normal.
Not seriously.
Oh, maybe I should see a therapist. Okay, so a couple things, and I don't want to get too caught up on technicalities, but you just read that directly out of Genesis, right?
Right.
So you said Adam makes love to his wife Eve, right?
Mm-hmm.
They use the word wife,
uh-huh,
which shouldn't really exist yet, right? It's not like a priest was there to bless their marriage.
Well, that's how we think about marriage in our government and culture, but at this point in time, marriage is the committed covenant relationship between a man and a woman, and they have sex and make love and have kids, and that's marriage.
Okay, fine. Yeah, I don't want to...
According to Genesis.
Yeah, that's... Okay.
in this context so far.
And then what happens to Cain after he kills his brother?
Life goes on. It's not necessarily great. He gets married. Apparently there's another lady that comes out of nowhere. Possibly from this like outside of Eden place, or possibly
okay. That I was gonna say that makes me feel a little bit better, because I was gonna say, is there like a daughter nobody talks about?
There also could potentially be other
kids
that Adam and Eve have that aren't mentioned. And people lived like hundreds of years at this point, which is also...
Right, you're talking about like the humans have been around for hundreds of years?
No, I forgot.
You're saying like literally a human life is...
Like people live to be like 800 years old.
Yeah, I don't buy
in this time. And then there's a time later where there's another curse that God's like, you're going to live till like 120 at best or so. Anyway, that's a sign.
I heard earlier, I thought you said that as you were reading a passage, is your lifespan. I'm paraphrasing here, but your lifespan is going to be like 120 years. I think you said 120 years specifically.
Yeah.
That's kind of weird.
It is kind of weird. And then beyond that, some people still live to like be a little older than 120. But anyway, lifespans used to be really old. According to the Bible, that changed for some reason. I don't know if it's a science thing or if it's
I don't think
God felt like it.
I don't think that's accurate.
I mean,
there were some species that lived hundreds of years, but humans, no. And is this supposed to be? And if we think of the birth of Christ as like the year zero, right? Do we know when this was supposed to be? Like how many thousands of years before?
I forgot exactly.
I don't know if it specifies or not.
Well, I mean, the best guess that people can give is there's very accurate or very detailed, I should say, like accounts of genealogies. And then eventually you get to genealogies that are a part of recorded history. So if you like, and then it gives ages and stuff like, oh, there's this character. He had this son, this son, and this son. This character dies at the age of blank. So you can work your way backwards from something that you do know. I think it's usually a couple thousand years, which is where the new earthers don't agree with science and new earthers dating and all that. Let's see. It says 4,000 BCE according to ChatGPT.
Okay, that sounds...
So 4,000 years.
Okay. So we talked about Garden of Eden, that kind of transition. They did the sex good, and they had a couple kids. Cain kills Abel, rude.
Mm-hmm.
And then you said life goes on. So, and there's other stuff you said going on outside the Garden of Eden. So we think.
Well, now they're all outside the Garden of Eden.
And that's not so. And again, sorry if I asked this already, but the Garden of Eden is more a metaphor. It's not supposed to be like, is it a metaphor for heaven, or is it supposed to be like a literal place on earth? Because I don't think they specify in Christianity, but Mormons believe it's like Jackson County, Missouri or something, right? Is that a thing?
I think that's what Mormons believe. Good question. Because I think my follow-up question is like, okay, if they're cast out of the Garden of Eden and the Garden of Eden is like a physical place, is it still just there and stuff's happening outside of it? And like, what happened to it is kind of my question. I'd say it's a metaphor for heaven. Like when Adam and Eve were in the garden, they were walking closely with God. They could communicate with him. God gave them work to do and things like the land to steward and stuff like that. Revelation talks more about a city than a garden. So it's kind of like after the Garden of Eden has been advanced and humanity has stewarded the resources enough to be able to build buildings and like stuff like that, it is now a city. So it's probably kind of like both a metaphor and a physical place at the time. It's definitely not Jackson County, Missouri, because most of the Bible takes place in like the Middle East region. So, and then scientifically, like our earliest knowledge of the human race is like the Fertile Crescent area. So I think that's the best guess for where it physically was.
Okay.
It probably got.
Fair enough. Well, it makes me feel better that stuff's happening outside the Garden of Eden, so I don't have to think about incest as much.
Yes, there's definitely incest. Don't get me
Okay.
wrong. There's a lot of incest.
I like that. So we have Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, but there's stuff outside the Garden of Eden.
Potentially, yeah.
And well, presumably, right? So what about, how did the people that exist outside the Garden of Eden gain autonomy and like forbidden knowledge too? Do they have their own tree of knowledge? Is that what you called it? How do they
Well, if it was,
betray God?
I mean, I don't know in terms of like Homo sapiens living outside the Garden of Eden.
Well, you talked about Cain's
wife.
Could be.
I don't know. The only like people that they mention are the Nephilim, which are like the angels, which means that I think the angels were created before the earth. And so they probably already had their whole rebellion thingy with Satan before. I don't really know how the timeline lines up. It might not even be like a timeline the way that we think about time, but I don't know. That's my thoughts.
Okay. Yeah, we can come back to that later. But out of curiosity, because if there is stuff going on outside Garden of Eden, that would be my follow-up. Do they have the same knowledge as like Adam and Eve? How do they gain it? Because unless the devil is everywhere too, how do they get to that level of knowledge? You understand my point though, right?
Right. And I also don't necessarily think that if there were actual like humans or what we would think of as like cavemen or Homo sapiens or something, I don't necessarily think that God would be communicating with them in the same way at this point, because a lot of Genesis is talking about God's relationship with this specific family line. And yeah, he interacts a little bit with people outside of that family line, and you see that every once in a while. But for the most part, most of his attention is focused on the line of Abraham, which came from Adam and Noah, and then everybody post Abraham, God has a very special relationship with. So I don't know if he would necessarily be having that type of special relationship with people outside of the Garden of Eden just because they're also people. Like, ultimately, we all have Jesus, but
the way I thought about it is like the Garden of Eden is a metaphor for heaven, and then he kind of casts them out of heaven when they eat the apple.
Could be something.
Okay. Yeah.
In essence, that's the vibe. But we don't have to worry about literally.
Okay, and then there's a whole other thing that I don't want to go into now, but I think we talked before. It's like the animals go to heaven, the dogs go to heaven. There are all these other animals in the Garden of Eden. Do they become autonomous too, or what? Do they become sinful? What happens there? We don't have to dive into that, but I mean, food for thought. If you want to go into it later, bring it up. Think about it as we talk here. But transitioning from Cain and Abel, how does that lead into Noah's Ark now? Because that's next in Genesis, right? Let me know if I'm
skipping. Noah's Ark. Noah is like several generations later. I think I looked it up.
So he's still not too far down from Adam and Eve, though?
No, I think I looked up that. Oh, no, I didn't. Let me see. Let me ask ChatGPT. How many?
I don't need an exact number. It's just I think of this as like.
Yeah, it's a handful of generations later.
Okay.
10th generation from Adam, he says. Adam, Seth, Enosh, Canaan, Mahalalel, Jared, Enoch, Methuselah, Lamech, and Noah. Those are all the people listed in order leading up to Noah.
Okay. I can live with that.
So his great, it's like that.
His great that
from Emperor's New Groove.
Yeah, okay.
Great. Anywho, yes. So Noah, and the world is so wicked and messed up at this point, and there's been so much Nephilim having sex with the women and all that. And God says, God said how it corrupts the world. Or wait, Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight and was full of violence. God saw how corrupt the earth had become, for all the people on the earth had corrupted their ways. So God said to Noah, I am going to put an end to all people, for the earth is filled with violence because of them. I am surely going to destroy both them and the earth. So make yourself an ark of cypress wood, make room in it, and coat it with pitch inside and out. This is how you are to build it. Da da da. He gives specific instructions for the dimensions. And he says, I'm going to bring floodwaters on the earth to destroy all life under the heavens. Every creature that has breath of life in it, everything on earth will perish. But I will establish my covenant with you, and you will enter the ark, you and your sons, and your wife and your sons' wives with you. You are to bring into the ark 2 of all living creatures, male and female, to keep them alive with you. 2 of every kind of bird, every kind of animal, and every kind of creature that moves along the ground will come to you and be kept alive. You are to take every kind of food that is to be eaten and store it away as food for you and for them. Noah did everything just as God had commanded him. So he does. There's the flood. There's a long account of how long it lasts. And then they're the last ones on earth.
Okay, so, and that was in one of the videos that Sam sent me, the Genesis summary, how Noah is commissioned to be the new Adam. Also, before we get into that, and I know I brought this up as we were prepping here, but there was some weird shit they said about Noah doing something shameful while naked in a tent.
Yeah, that was his
so what is that
sons
about?
later.
That's after the flood thing?
Yeah, that's after the flood. So wickedness continues.
Yeah, so like what the hell?
It's very vague. It doesn't say what happened, but basically
it's just creepy though that it's
there's I don't know how to explain all of it, but a theme that you'll see throughout Genesis is like people have a lot of descendants, and then some of those descendants are blessed and some are cursed. Like the distinction between like Enoch and Jacob, or Ishmael and Isaac. Like one of them is part of the line that will lead to Jesus and is fruitful and is blessed, and the other part is cursed, and that creates a lot of conflict throughout history. So this is an explanation of Noah's son. Who's his youngest son? Ham, the father of Canaan, saw his father naked and told his 2 brothers.
Yeah,
so Ham did something shameful. I think he basically saw his dad in his tent drunk and naked and went and like teased him to his brothers and maybe did something else. I don't know.
Okay.
But anyway, so Canaan and his descendants are now cursed. And throughout the rest of the Bible, you see a lot of conflict with this people group. So it's sort of illustrating that generational sin.
And again, maybe it could be my misunderstanding, but it's like God's plan didn't work if there was still shame and a bunch of shit going on after the flood.
Well, I think one thing to distinguish throughout Genesis is like a lot of crap happens, and it's because people disobeyed God. Like God isn't designing and specifically telling people to do X, Y, and Z bad thing. Because they have free will, they are sinning against God continually, despite what God told them to do. And so all this crap is happening, and yet God's plan is still continuing, and he's having to make adjustments for people and having to roll with the punches. But at the end of the day, like Jesus still came, he still died for our sins. God's plan still happened, but there was a lot of pain and sin along the way, not out of God's fault, but out of humanity's fault.
But if it's the intention to be the new Adam and God's plan is like still working out, what's the point? Why need a flood? Why? Also, we can kind of lean on that, but is this supposed to be taken literally that Noah actually single-handedly built this freaking cruise ship size ark all by himself and literally brought 2 of every species? Because I think that's insane. Like that's, yeah, I think we were talking earlier how you said it could kind of be, a metaphor, but to believe the earth was flooded and all these animals survived on this ship, I don't like that. That's really kind of weird for me.
Yeah, that's fair. I think some people take it literally and some people don't. And at the end of the day, the story of like God singling out this family to preserve amidst all of the sin in the world, even though that family also sins. It doesn't necessarily mean that all of it was a waste. And I get your question. It's like, okay, well, what was the point if it's just going to be a round story and happen all over again?
Yeah, and that's we'll going into Abraham and C.S. Lewis's explanation of it. The point that he makes there kind of contradicts this. So that's why I want to bring it up now and remind me we can come back to it.
Okay, I'll remind you. But that's a valid question. I think if you were to take it literally, some arguments that could make.
I don't think there's any evidence for that.
I was just gonna say, like, people lived. I forgot how old Noah was when he died, but it was like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. So he had time.
Well,
God gave him very specific instructions, and it said that the animals will come to you. So
if you build it, they will come.
Yeah, exactly. So God was probably also involved in that building process, and it wasn't just the manpower of a single guy. It was probably very closely in partnership with God. But if people want to take it as a metaphor, I'm not mad at them. There is some interesting, geological evidence of a widespread flood I don't know if there's evidence of a global flood. And as a hydrologist, I don't really know how that would work, because there's
the thing is to say the earth was flooded. Like, what the hell? That's really dumb. And then I think some of our very religious cousins brought up the bones being found in mountaintops that belong to fish or something. It's like, okay, well, tectonic plates create mountains, right? Geography changes over extremely long periods of time, right? There are other explanations for that.
Mm-hmm. I think there is some interesting geology that I would be curious to look into. I also wouldn't be surprised if it was a regional flood and not the whole world. Because
that's so much more reasonable,
right? And then that's where people if this is relatively early on in human history, and I don't know if the freezing has happened that allowed people to go across oceans and inhabit North America and stuff like that. I don't know how that all fits in, but it's possible. There are so many different theories. And again, this is written probably as a word of mouth or an oral tradition. And so it might not be 100%.
Also, quick question in your picture here. Is that a freaking dragon flying off the ark there? What is that?
Oh, that'd be cool. That could be one of the
is that why dragons didn't make it, as they just ditched the ark?
Could be. Oh yeah, go to my next meme.
Okay. Give me a second to find it, but I know which one you're talking about.
That one cracked me up too.
Oh, this one?
Yeah, when you overslept and can't find Noah, and it's a picture of a dinosaur on a paddleboard, screaming.
Yeah, I thought that was cute.
Poor guy.
Okay. Sorry, where were we before I had to jump in to say something stupid?
You were saying how unreasonable the
flood is, and plus you just said Noah lived for hundreds of years, so he had time. Okay, how the hell do we know he lived hundreds of years? We just established this was roughly 10 generations, called 1,000. Well, I was going to say 1,000 years, assuming each generation's 100 years, which is an overshot by today's standards. But I mean, did writing even exist at this point? I don't think there's there's no documentation. How could you have documented how long someone lived? Back then, they didn't even know what a year was. They had no freaking clue that the earth revolved around the sun back then. So that maybe this is, again, where you're saying someone lived 300 years. Does a year mean something completely different then? And there's no documentation of it.
That's a good question. When we discovered, astronomy, days, years.
I was I'm a Gemini.
I wonder, that's a good question. And I think a lot of these things that we now have scientific language for, people generally knew something was happening and they kept records in their own way based on the science context that they were in. And yeah, we have a lot more advanced language now, but I'm sure that they recognize patterns and stuff like that. I don't know if that plays into it, but I think it probably was the oral tradition aspect, especially since this is all following one family line, and the family line knows that they are God's chosen people. They probably have a lot of interfamily conversations to all be on the same page of like who is descended from who. That's also probably a big cultural thing at the time, is like when you address yourself, you're like, hey, I'm Sammy, daughter of Mark, son of whatever, grandpa Ed, or no, what was grandpa's name? Bob? His name was Bob. Like, I'm Sammy,
Bob.
daughter of Mark, son of
Yeah.
Bob. Like
that's
you introduce yourself based on your genealogy. So I think it was probably just passed on information that eventually got written down.
Okay, so yeah, we don't have to hit too hard on that, but that's a point I just want to make, is that you're talking about years before years even existed. It's something like that. So it's a little
maybe
weird.
Later on, something else I noticed in Job, which we're not talking about, but theoretically Job happened somewhere within the timeline of Genesis, but it's told as a separate story. There's mention in there of the constellation Orion. And so I was like, oh, didn't the person that like discovered and named Orion come way after all this?
Yeah.
We were talking about it in our like Bible study group, and it's like they probably recognize the constellations. They might just not have the same names or mapping knowledge that we had, but they probably looked at that and said, hey, that's whatever name we want to call it, which eventually later got coined as Orion. So there's probably just a lot of common knowledge at the time contextually that we underestimate, because now we have all the fancy schmancy names and textbooks and stuff. So
okay. What's so Noah, like, I'm kind of taking it more metaphorically here, again, to think the entire world was flooded and 2 of every species. I think that's ridiculous. So what do you have to add here, and how does this lead on? We talked about the shame where he's naked in the tent. What happens after this, and kind of what are the results and why?
Yeah, I can talk for a little bit about some of there's a lot of details after this that don't necessarily go into the children's Bible. The next main story that is told is the Tower of Babel. So that is just kind of demonstrating that civilization is growing. People have discovered the brick. They're discovering their power as a society. And they try to build this tower to reach the heavens. And God views this as an act of rebellion and pride, and ends up scattering all these people that were coming together to build this Tower of Babel. He confuses their language, so they can't communicate with each other anymore, can't build the tower, and scatters them across the earth, which in biblical lore explains the different languages and the different geographic areas for some of these people groups. And then you begin to see a lot of conflict arise between these different people groups now that they're all separated. And you also see zoomed in again on that family line of Abraham. And Abraham, I think I did look this up also, is Noah's great grandson, among other grandsons, but he's the most important one that's emphasized. So again, many generations have passed between Noah and now Abraham, and now the story of Abraham begins, which I'm sure you'll have quite a few questions about, specifically the infamous story of, infamous or famous, depending who you are, story of him and his son Isaac. But the primary promise that the rest of Genesis sort of revolves around happens in Genesis 12. I'll just read it. Genesis 12:1. The Lord had said to Abraham, go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. So this is the promised land that you often hear about. And then God says in verse 2, I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. So he's basically telling Abraham, hey, you're special. I'm going to bless you. You're going to bless others through your line. And he goes on to make more specific promises to Abraham later. I'm trying to remember where he says to look at the stars.
I think that's pretty late. I mean, at least according to the video.
I think it might be. It might be when he's getting discouraged.
They're gonna have this many children, and that's a lot of children. It's like
yeah, basically.
So is Abraham?
Oh yeah, Genesis 15. Sorry, I found it.
Go ahead.
Later on, a few chapters later, Abraham still has not had a kid yet. Let's see. So Abraham's starting to like question God a little bit. He says, "Sovereign Lord, what can you give me since I remain childless, and the only one who will inherit my estate is Eliezer of Damascus?" And Abram said, "You have given me no children, so a servant in my household will be my heir." Then the word of the Lord came to him, "This man will not be your heir, but a son who is your own flesh and blood will be your heir." He took him outside and said, Look up at the sky and count the stars, if indeed you can count them." Then he said to him, "So shall your offspring be." Abram believed in the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. So that's kind of part 2 of God's promise to Abraham, just kind of reassuring him like, hey, you're going to be a great nation. You're going to have a lot of children or a lot of descendants. Trust me.
Okay. And I'm sorry. I think I missed part of your intro here, but what is kind of the connection between where we left Noah and Abraham? How exactly does he come into the picture? Is he just chosen because he's less sinful than a lot of other people, or he's picked kind of in the same way Mary is he's just a good old guy who wants to do something good with his life? How does he come into the picture exactly?
I don't think it necessarily says why he picked him, like what's going to set him apart from the others. I guess that's a good enough guess for me. But I was saying that Abraham is one of Noah's great-great-great-grandchildren. So it's a few generations removed at this point. The Tower of Babel happened in between. So there's different people groups and nations. And now Abraham is part of this nation that God's going to set apart. And then the family line gets zoomed in on from there.
Okay. Do we need to touch on Babylon at all? Or do you want to go straight? I don't mind. That's not something I'm super familiar with. I think in the videos that we've been referencing that they just touch on it briefly. Like, do you just want to give us like a very quick rundown?
I did give a little bit of a brief summary.
Okay.
I can't explain it that well other than
no, that's all right.
Human pride led them to
but it was just more shit happening that God wasn't too happy with.
Yeah.
Okay.
Classic.
Anyway, next book or next kind of lead in is Abraham. Now, one thing we brought up several times, and one thing that pissed me off a lot, which thank you, C.S. Lewis, he kind of answered for me, is Abraham's sacrifice of Isaac.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm sorry, I'm leaning far away from my mic here. I hope that came through all right. Let me get back. What was the lead up to the sacrifice of Isaac, and why the heck did God want Abraham to kill his son for funsies?
For funsies?
Yeah, what was the idea there?
So there's a lot that happened. Are you familiar with the story of Hagar and Ishmael at all?
No.
Okay, so basically, not Noah. Abram, soon to become Abraham with the renaming, is married to a girl named Sarah, or Sarai, soon to be name changed to Sarah. And they're getting old, they're not having kids, and yet God promised Abraham that he would have many descendants and that a great nation will come from him. And yet no kids are to be had. She's not having a luck.
That was another thing. Is like it said Abraham and his wife couldn't have kids, and it's like it did not go into detail at all. I'm like, what the hell? And then the wife sent Abraham off to
sleep with her servant. So this is a family having servants was very culturally common, and whatever your servant has, you also have, including children. So if Sarah,
God. It sounds like God sent Abraham off to go bang a hooker, and he was okay.
No.
But it's not his wife.
Let me explain.
Okay.
Let me explain.
All right.
So
go ahead.
Hagar is Sarah's servant, And so Sarah is starting to feel a little insecure that she's not able to have a kid. And she knows about this promise that God made to Abraham. And so she's like, well, it's not happening for me. So let's have you sleep with my servant, Hagar, because what's hers is mine because she's my servant. So it's still technically like Abraham's child, not born from me, his wife, but we technically still like have ownership of the child. So let's just like fast track it and do it this way. So Sarah basically asks her husband Abraham to sleep with the servant Hagar, and Hagar gets pregnant, has a kid. His name is Ishmael. So this is Abraham's first son, but it's not Abraham and Sarah's son. It's Abraham and Hagar's son. But God intended for Abraham and Sarah to be the parents of the son that he promised them. And so they fast-tracked it. They went away that God didn't intend for them to go. They had Ishmael. This is also interesting. Basically, everything leading
God
up to this.
Bless that. That was their idea, not his.
Say it again.
God didn't bless the idea of Abraham's wife sending Abraham off to go have sex with this servant.
No.
It was the wife's idea.
It was the wife's idea because she was losing faith that she would be the one to have the kid because she was getting old. So she's like, okay, well, it's not happening. So
that was the reason is they couldn't have kids just because they were getting old.
There could be multiple reasons, but
okay, yeah. I mean, I don't care about the specific, but they made it sound like it was God's idea for Abraham to go have sex with some lady. But so it's not that. Okay, thank you for clarifying.
Nope, that was their own nature chiming in and saying, well, I'm going to take this into my own hands. And it didn't go super well because Ishmael went on to become also the father of a great nation, but that nation is now constantly at war with the nation that Isaac created. So, fun fact, I don't know that much about this, but Islam believes that Ishmael is like the chosen son. Christianity believes that it's Isaac. And so there's kind of this like warring of those two nations, which sort of turned into this conflict between like, I don't want to explain it too much.
Okay, well that's good to know. But I guess going into that now, so Abraham's kids were Isaac and Jacob, right? Abraham's kids were Ishmael, Isaac, and then there are some others. Jacob was one of Isaac's kids, I think. Yes. But let's pause before Isaac has kids. So now they took it into their own hands. They had Ishmael. And then ultimately, even though Sarah is super old and shouldn't be able to have kids, she does. God blesses them with Isaac as promised. And here, sorry, I'm going to pull up your family tree. They are so excited about Isaac. And Abraham loves him so much. He knows that this is the son that God promised them and the one that the many nations that God promised would come through. And so it's a big challenge when God's like, hey, you know this son that I promised to you that you finally have after so much trial and after so much doubt, he's finally here. And now I want you to go sacrifice him. And undoubtedly, I'm sure that Abraham's a little bit like, this doesn't quite make sense because there was all this lead up where you promised me this son and now he's here and now you want me to get rid of him essentially. And so, yeah, geez. So Abraham had a shitload of kids before Isaac. So Isaac was the last? Because he had all these kids with Keturah. Did you mention her yet? So we got Ishmael. I forgot about Keturah. Yeah, so he just had a bang. That might have been after. Well, why would he do Keturah if he was successful with Sarah? That might have been. I don't know where I forgot about her. She doesn't seem important. Well, that's why you had 6 kids with her. Like, yeah, okay. That might have been post Isaac, I think. Well, that's the thing is, like, why would it be post Isaac if he was successful? The second wife of Abraham after Sarah's death. So he moved on pretty quick, huh?
I don't know how quick, but
well enough to have 6.
you did move on.
Okay. But anyway, I guess we don't have to hang on Keturah. But
Yeah, it
you're
doesn't
saying
give
that
any
was
details
after.
about her. Basically, the main characters that are coexisting in the same timeline are Sarah and Hagar, and then Ishmael, Abraham's first son, technically, and then Isaac, who's like the promised son.
Okay, that's why Isaac's the only one you hear about.
Yeah. So anyway, so then we can talk about God asking Abraham to sacrifice.
Yes. So
I know
what was the point of that? Go ahead.
Well, just to justify where you're coming from, the first time I read this, I remember I was sitting in my dorm with my freshman roommate who was a Christian, and I was like a brand new Christian, and I was reading it, and I finished reading it, and I closed my Bible, and I was like, what? That seems so mean. Why would God ask Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, who he just gave him as a gift, and now he's like, you know what, I want to take it away. And then ultimately he ends up providing an alternative sacrifice, and his plan all along was not that Abraham would kill Isaac. He was going to provide something else. He knew that was going to happen, but still, I thought it seemed like a pretty mean trick to play for no good reason. So I agree to some extent. That initial reaction, I had the same one. The point is that Abraham is like one of the first of this long line of God's chosen people, and his faithfulness is really crucial in that really important role that he's in. And so God was testing his faithfulness to say, like, okay, how much are you really bought into this promise that I made to you? Because my promise to you hinges on this son that I gave you. So do you trust me that my promise is still going to happen, even if I ask you to kind of offer it back up to me? And so there's a possibility that Abraham still had faith that Isaac would be okay in the end, or that God's promise would still happen, even if he did sacrifice Isaac. So it was a kind of a test of Abraham's willingness to be obedient to God, even if it didn't make sense. Because previously, being obedient to God, even when it didn't make sense, resulted in them trying to fast track and having Ishmael instead of Isaac. So it was kind of a test of faith, making sure they're on the same page. And then God never intended for Abraham to actually kill Isaac. He was always going to provide the alternative ram in the bushes for him to sacrifice instead. So yeah, a test of faith basically is what it was. And it seemed kind of mean. I agree. But
okay, so it was a test of faith and kind of a way to get Abraham to believe in the plan all along. But you said, so Isaac lives, right?
Isaac lives.
Isaac lives. Do we know if this sacrifice, where does this happen? Is it one of those sacred temples? Because Abraham's Jewish, right?
Yes, I guess. I don't know if the Jewish people is like a coined term yet, but for all intents and purposes, I guess so. I don't know. Yeah, it happens at the top of this hill. So it talks about how they're going up the hill. And oftentimes this story, you can go to the slide that shows the artwork for this. A lot of renditions show Abraham going up with this like little boy. But according to the timeline set out here, Isaac's probably like at least 20 years old. So he's a full adult. He very well could have resisted his dad. So it also potentially shows a bit of the faithfulness of Isaac too. Where Isaac's
we're assuming like he's conscious or something. But
he is. He's asking his dad as they're climbing up the hill. I don't think he knows until he probably starts to get tied up for the sacrifice. But he asks his dad, like, hey, Dad, where's the animal for the burnt offering? And Abraham's like, don't worry about it. Let me see if I can find it.
Well, why even... He got replaced by what? You said a bunny, right? Like
not a bunny. It was a ram.
Oh, a ram. Okay, so why... That's still rude. So a ram died, though. Like, why...
Animal sacrifice was a very common cultural thing. I don't agree with it.
Okay, it's a cultural thing. That's one thing. But why would God want you to kill one of his own creatures if he didn't? Like, that's still... It's not as bad as killing your kid, but...
Well, I guess I won't exclusively blame culture. It was like a religious thing That's how like atonements were made. Traditionally was something had to pay the penalty for your sin, and traditionally it was animals. And so throughout the Old Testament, you see lots of rituals around animal sacrifices. Even like back to Cain and Abel, I was talking about how Abel would give the best of his flock as a sacrifice to God. And so that was a very normal thing, animal sacrifices. Human sacrifices was not really a thing, at least in
Not yet.
people's
It's
world.
popular later, though.
Probably, unfortunately, but
Okay,
anyway,
so
it's a symbol, and then that leads into the symbology of Jesus. So Isaac is sort of an image of what's to come with God sacrificing his son Jesus for us, and that kind of, I mean, not to completely justify the story through that, because I agree, like the story face value does seem harsh, but God is going to do the same thing for us that he's asking Abraham to do with his son.
okay. That makes sense. And because when I first heard this, I thought, until you corrected me, a couple months ago, but I thought Abraham went through with it and killed his son, which wasn't the case.
No, he didn't. I can read the end.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, first off, let's see. Let me see if I can just skim through.
Omniscient.
I can hear whatever you're doing right now. Are you clicking on stuff, or is that me?
I was muted. Did you hear me?
Oh.
What'd you hear?
I heard the word omniscient.
Sorry, I was looking at it on my other screen.
Oh, interesting.
Weird.
So anyway, let's see. God said, "Hey, Abraham." Abraham said, "Yo, what's up?" God said, "Take your son and sacrifice him as a burnt offering." And Abraham got up, loaded his donkey. He took with him Isaac. He brought wood. Isaac carried wood up the mountain, which is symbolic of Jesus carrying his cross later on.
But Isaac knew he was...
Not necessarily, because when they're going up the mountain, Isaac said, "Hey, Dad." I'm paraphrasing. He was like, "Hey, Dad." And Abraham said, "Yes, my son. The fire and wood are here, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham said, "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." Which is also a questionable statement. Like, did Abraham know that God was going to provide something else? Is a question. We don't know. But that maybe seems to imply.
That's not, according to C.S. Lewis, I don't think so.
Okay, cool. But, and maybe it's just like a hope, where he's like, I hope God provides the land. But then it says, when they reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham." "Here I am," he replied. "Do not lay a hand on the boy," he said. "Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." Abraham looked up, and there in the thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called the place, "The Lord will provide." And to this day it is said, "On the mountain of the Lord, it will be provided." So, yeah, God provided an alternative sacrifice after seeing that that Abraham was faithful to follow through on it, even though it was undoubtedly really hard to do.
Okay, and I mean, in the picture you got here, you're saying a burnt offering, and there's like wood and fire, but he also has a knife. Not to get caught up on like a little technical detail, but was he supposed to?
I think you kill it and then you burn it.
Okay, that's
my guess.
Okay.
So anyway, yeah, he doesn't end up killing Isaac, which is pretty significant. It'd be that also, not to say that makes it okay, but it certainly makes it better.
Okay. Yeah. And it's all about, he has like more faith now.
Right.
After. Okay, so we established that I need to, when I actually go through and read Genesis, I want to dig into this because there are some other details. But so C.S. Lewis's explanation Let me just read. Well, I'll put the quote up on the screen here. So this is again, thank you, Sam, for kindly providing all of all the Christian books. So I did actually get through all of these. So
Wow.
I'm going to be quoting from The Problem of Pain is when he talked about this. I think this is chapter 6. Let me just double check in case everyone wants to go through and actually look. Yeah, it's chapter 6. But yeah, he talks a lot about Abraham here, so I'm just going to go for it. But let's see. A familiar example is Abraham's trial when he was ordered to sacrifice Isaac. With the historicity or the morality of that story, I am not now concerned. But with the obvious question, if God is omniscient, he must have known what Abraham would do without any experiment. Why then this needless torture? But as St. Augustine points out, whatever God knew, Abraham, at any rate, did not know that this obedience could endure such a command until the event taught him. And the obedience which he did not know that he would choose, he cannot be said to have chosen. The reality of Abraham's obedience was the act itself, and what God knew in knowing that Abraham would obey was Abraham's actual obedience on that mountaintop at that moment. To say that God need not have tried the experiment is to say that because God knows, the thing known by God need not exist. So it's a little messy, but do you kind of hear what he's saying?
It's kind of more for Abraham's benefit than
it is 100% for Abraham's benefit. And here's a better. I hope I might have fumbled a couple of those words, but I hope I got it through. We got it up on the screen. So a paraphrase that I read that was very good. Let me make sure I find it here. Okay, so yeah, here's a good paraphrase I found. So when God commands Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, God knows that Abraham will obey and that he will not in fact require the sacrifice, but Abraham does not know what he will do until he does it. The obedience and the faith which accepts the command without question are Abraham's to give, and they are really given. The reality of his obedience is not diminished by the fact that God knows it in advance. Indeed, the act becomes what it is precisely because it is freely offered, despite the suffering involved. But the point is that God knows, he knows the past, present, and future. He knows exactly what is going to happen. Mm-hmm. He knows Isaac is not going to die. This is 100% for Abraham to benefit from.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely agree.
Okay.
And he's going to be, him and his descendants are going to be put up to a lot of stuff in the future. Their faithfulness is really going to be tested. And so this is a pretty big test for him to go through and succeed.
Yeah, but he probably became stronger and much more faithful because of it.
Exactly. Yeah. So that is
the problem with pain is like why do we go through pain? And it's because if you look at it the right way, it benefits us and it helps with faith if you're open to it.
Mm-hmm. Right.
However, based on the passage that you just read, which I didn't know before this, but you said something along the lines of God said to Abraham, now I know you're willing to do this, implying that he didn't know before, which goes against what C.S. Lewis just said. So unless God is just saying that to help Abraham get it. But you see the contradiction I just made?
A little bit. This might not matter, but one interesting thing that you also see throughout the New Testament is you see like this phrase, the angel of the Lord, a lot. So here, that's what it's talking about. It says he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay a son, but the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven and said, don't lay a hand on the boy. Now I know that you fear God. So the angel of the Lord is how an example of, this is what I've heard. I'm not an expert in this. It's like a Christophany, which is an appearance of Christ before the incarnation of Jesus. So like the Trinity, God, Son, Holy Spirit has existed since the beginning of time. But we typically think that the main God character in the Old Testament is God the Father. But Jesus, or at least like pre-incarnation version of Jesus, supposedly appears a lot. This could be an example of that. So Jesus still is God, but in this case, it seems to say, now I know that you fear God, or like you fear my Father, basically. And so he's kind of mediating in this way.
Okay. So it wasn't directly from God, which, okay.
In a way it was, but in a way it wasn't, because Jesus is God, but also mediator with God and people. So I wouldn't read into that too much. And even if it was God,
fair,
it'd still be like, to say, oh, now I know, it doesn't necessarily mean like I didn't know before. It's just me showing my approval and commending you for your faithfulness in this moment.
Okay. That's good. So we established it, and that the way C.S. Lewis phrased it, that made me understand it a little bit better and get off. I was saying before, like, I have problems with God saying kill your son, but when he knows the outcome ahead of time and he knows it's not actually going to happen, that makes more sense. So, and I think I mentioned this earlier, and we had to tie it back in. But God knows everything. He knows the future. He knows how everything will turn out. When we talked about it at the beginning, and I said I need to come back to this, remind me. God knows exactly, should have known exactly how Adam and Eve would have turned out. He should have known that Adam or Eve, I think it was actually Eve who grabbed the apple, right? Mm-hmm. He should have known that all that crap was going to happen. He should have known that the devil was going to tempt them, leading into Noah's Ark. He expects Noah to be the next Adam, yet all the crap still happens after Noah's Ark. God knows all that stuff that's going to happen. Why jump in and say you got to fix all this if he knows it's not going to be fixed? Do you kind of get the point here that I'm trying to make? Because we just established that for Abraham. That makes sense for Abraham. Why it contradicts? Here's the plan that I know isn't going to work. Like, what the hell?
I understand what you're saying. I had a question about the last thing you said, where you said something like, okay, now you got to go fix this. Who are you talking about there?
I was talking about Noah fixing the earth and God killing everybody in the flood, and then he goes on to redeem humanity, which didn't happen.
I think the building of the ark and the flood is also, in a way, a test of obedience, testing Noah's obedience in the same way that he tested Abraham's obedience. I agree that I'm sure God knew that sin would continue after the flood. I would have to look at the wording again, but I think it was like a mini redemption before the full redemption. Sort of like in the same way that, yeah, Jesus came, he died for our sins, but sin still happens, evil still happens. That was part of the plan, and good came out of it, but it wasn't, and it was partially a reset, but it wasn't a full reset. It won't be a full reset until the redemption of all things at the end in Revelation. And so I don't think that God's like, oh crap, that didn't go to plan. Oops. I think there are little mini redemption arcs within the course of all of this crap that's happening. And those are just examples of those things. But the wording is confusing when God's like, I regret that I've made humanity. Let's start over.
Yeah, he knows everything.
Mm-hmm.
Another thing, sorry, I'm leaning away from my mic again. The whole man being created in God's image thing, I've talked about that before. I struggle with that because we talked about animals going to heaven and evolution continues. We're not always going to be humans, although you say that rapture should solve that. We'll get raptured before we evolve anymore. That's the thing, is I just don't think evolution ends, but I digress. Anyway, I wanted to make that point. God knows everything, but it seems like the way the Bible puts it is he made mistakes that he has to correct, and it's like, if he knows, why are there mistakes in the first place?
Again, that's a distinction of like, is it God who's making? Well, that's a complicated question because it's like, is it God making the mistakes or is it humans making the mistakes? But
And
God knows the humans are making the mistakes.
Okay.
So does that mean that God is making a mistake by doing something that he knows is going to result in human mistake? And it's a whole thing, and it's hard to answer.
Okay. No, fair enough. I think I get your point there.
A lot more interesting than things being perfect from the get-go and none of us having any free will.
I don't want to go off on like too much of a tangent. So in terms of Genesis, where we wrapped up here with Abraham's sacrifice, which didn't work, what are we missing here? Anything else you need to touch on or fill in?
Well, we are at an hour and a half, so as a decent stopping point. We're only about halfway through Genesis at this point. We're in chapter like 25 is when Abraham dies, and it continues on from Isaac's life. So there's a lot more that happens, a lot more names that you might recognize, like Jacob and Joseph and all those fun stories.
Thank you for putting this in the deck.
Oh yeah, Isaac looking at Abraham the whole walk back down the mountain. What the F was this?
Yeah. No, okay, that's fair. I'm okay wrapping it up. I don't want to take too much.
Yeah, and a lot of you see a lot of similar patterns from here on out. It's really interesting to read. The story of Joseph is probably one of my favorite stories in the Bible. And it talked about that a little bit in the Bible Project video.
The story of Joseph?
But what'd you say?
The story of Joseph?
The story of Joseph, yeah.
Okay, so I didn't hear about that, and that's another thing is I need you to explain this meme that you so kindly added. I was thinking Joseph as in Mary and Joseph, but this is a different Joseph.
This is a different Joseph. So Joseph is one of Jacob's sons. Jacob has this whole thing where he has 4 wives, but he only really loves one of them. It's the one that he wanted in the first place, but his like father-in-law tricked him into marrying these other women before he got to marry the one that he actually liked. And then he only had 2 children from the wife that he actually loved. Joseph was the first one. So Joseph is basically the favorite child out of all 12 children that Joseph has amongst the 4 wives that he has. And so all his brothers are really jealous of him, and they throw him into a cistern. They're going to kill him, but then they're like, nah, let's just sell him into slavery and make money off of him. So it's a whole story arc that's really fascinating and interesting. But Joseph gets sold into slavery. He ends up under the command of Pharaoh. At one point, he ends up in prison because Pharaoh's wife accuses him of sleeping with her. Ultimately, he works his way up to be second in command of Egypt, and he can interpret dreams, and he predicts that a famine's going to happen, and he prepares for the famine and prevents all of Egypt from starving. That's how Egypt gets indebted to Pharaoh, is because they have to like pay themselves, like they have to offer themselves in exchange for food. So that's how they become slaves. And that's when the Exodus happens, which is the next book. But anyway, Joseph's brothers end up coming back to him because they now are starving and need food. And Joseph is like, haha, now because I am second in command of Egypt and I predicted that this famine was going to happen, I now can provide food not only for you, but for all of Egypt. So thanks a lot for throwing me into the cistern and for selling me, because even though you meant to do that for evil, it actually worked out pretty nicely. And now all of you get to live along with many other people. So
we need to watch The Prince of Egypt. Do you remember that movie?
Yeah, I was thinking about that. That's about the story of Moses, but I think there's also a similar movie that's about the story of Joseph.
Okay. Well, I guess real quick,
story.
Yeah, before we wrap up here, keeping it fun. Sam, you were, again, kind enough to add some of these, so I'll drop a couple of these in.
Yes, we looked at this one.
Yeah. Oh, did we? Oh, shit, you're right. Yeah, sorry. We
like
did. I only had 2 this week, and I didn't. Yeah, believe it or not, I didn't put more memes in here.
I had more memes than you this week.
Yeah, I'm proud of you for that. I'm glad you're working on what's important. Anyway, I did put this one in. Guys, I'm trying to get Sam to finish the frickin' Fellowship of the Ring. She's only halfway through the first book.
I'm sorry, I'm not a good reader.
This is like the greatest universe ever created.
For those listening, this meme says, God creates humans.
Yeah.
Human creates Lord of the Rings. God. Now that's what I'm talking about.
And then this is the exact same meme, just in like another form. But
Yep.
it's funny how often these come up.
Well, that's just your Instagram algorithm knows what you care about.
I follow a lot of Tolkien accounts. Yeah, I feel like a lot of Christians do appreciate Tolkien though.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, because he was buddies with C.S. Lewis, who's like.
Well, that's not the reason. That's
Christianity's
probably
BFF.
part of the reason. But yeah, hell yeah, Lord of the Rings. Good shit. But anyway, we touched on everything here, Sam. Thanks for answering all my dumb questions as usual. I hope the quote that I gave from
C.S. Lewis.
does that help clarify your understanding of it too? I hope I was able to provide some productive input there.
Oh yeah, I think that's a great point that he makes, and I think we can tend to question God about all these things, but in reality, we don't know what trials are meant to increase our faith and increase our resilience and make us better stewards of
what doesn't kill us
that God has given us to do on this world.
Yeah. Anyway, good stuff. I think we can leave it there. Sam will have to discuss opportunities or some ideas for the next episode. If anybody has ideas, feel free to drop them in the comments as well. Again, I'll add the links to those Genesis videos in the show notes here. I'll see if I can just add that C.S. Lewis paraphrase as well, if that is helpful. But I think we'll leave it at that. Sam, thanks again for your time on this. We'll discuss some future episodes offline, but we hope to catch everybody next time.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.